In this section, we are going to take a look at what we refer to as an underserved population. For our area, Gunnison and Hinsdale County, we're specifically going to focus on immigrant Latina survivors. So the population of Hispanics in the United States is roughly 58.6 million, which makes it the second largest ethnic group. There are 5 states that have the largest Hispanic population. You'll see them listed up on the slide. They include California, Texas, Florida, New York, and Illinois. The most recently reported percentage of Hispanics in Gunnison is 18.4%. Keep in mind that Gunnison has other immigrant populations. There is a small pocket of people from Poland. There is also a pocket of individuals who are from Mexico. They're not considered to be part of the Latino or Latina population. Rather, they're considered Cora. It's a native population to Mexico, similar to the Native Americans here in the United States. Those individuals that identify as Cora do speak a little bit of Spanish typically. However, it's not their native language. So up on the slide, you will see some statistics for the prevalence of relationship violence and sexual assault inside of the Hispanic community. Go ahead and take a minute to read the information. Okay. So when talking about this population, there are some cultural values that you should be familiar with. You will see a variety of terminology up on the screen, as well as a definition of what those words mean. So go ahead and take a minute to review that. So something I want to make sure to point out to everybody is that it's important to know the background. Latinos and Latinas are grouped into one huge category, but know that even among that group, they ask one another where they're from. They come from different countries, they have different cultures, different value systems. So although these are main sort of themes or key points across the culture as a whole, it's important to have cultural competency and remember that not everybody is the same. So gender roles. The Hispanic family structures tend to have a patriarchal hierarchy and also to be socialized to follow a model that dictates that men have more power than women. So there's a couple more terms up there on the screen that you will see. Go ahead and review those. You will hear those a few times throughout the rest of the presentation. So a lack of respect for the opposite sex was seen as a stronger driver for domestic violence and sexual assault than even traditional gender roles. So Marianismo, which is one of the terms that you'll see up on the screen, originally referred to the devotion to Maria or the Virgin Mary. The term was first used by political scientist Evelyn Stevens in her 1973 essay, Marianismo, the Other Face of Machismo. It was in direct response to the male word and was meant to explain the phenomenon in Latin America, which women were either saints or whores. It is a supposed ideal of true femininity that women are supposed to live up to. So things like being modest, virtuous, sexually abstinent until marriage, and then being faithful and subordinate to their husbands. So these belief systems all come together and affect the values and just overall outlook of the culture. So for men, this idea that women are made to please them. For females, the idea of putting their family and their spouse first, so their children and their spouse before themselves. That may lead to feelings of isolation and trust issues. There's potential fear of the police or just overall mistrust of the government. They may feel embarrassment or even shame and that they have to keep abuse quiet. Religion and spirituality play a large role in this culture, in this community. So they're always wondering what the church would think, in terms of divorce or leaving an abusive partner. The idea that they may be shunned by their church it's a huge deal. It's very important to them. The quote that's up there that's in Spanish translates to, "Look, woman, you went and looked for it." So just like all of our other sections, there is a power and control wheel that's specific to the immigrant population. You were provided a handout for this as well that you can consult. So as you can see, there is a section that specifically applies to immigrants in this wheel. So failing to file papers to legalize immigration status, withdrawing or threatening to withdraw papers filed for residency. Those are threats that are unique to the immigrant population, something that a native-born survivor or victim would not necessarily be faced with. So immigration status is definitely used as a power tool. Having an undocumented status can be and has been used against victims. Just making them feel super isolated. Who are you going to call when you're needing help? If you're not here legally, you're going to be less inclined to reach out to law enforcement. You don't want to be deported. You feel like they wouldn't help you anyways. Hiding papers from a partner, so taking them and putting them somewhere where the victim, the survivor, can't access them. Making them sort of fear the breaking up of the family. So, if you don't listen to me, if you don't do what you're told, you're going to get deported. You'll be separated from your children. You'll be separated from your partner. Unfortunately, the clients, the survivors that we work with, may not be aware of their own rights, and their fear of deportation or losing their children is used against them. It's common for the clients that we work with here at Project Hope to not understand where resources are available to them, to just really not know where to turn to for help, because there's this fear of their immigration status being used against them. It's also common for people who are not an immigrant, who are not educated on this issue, to ask why people don't just come here legally. So there was a handout that you were provided to show the process to get here legally. So if you're taking a look at that handout, you can really see how difficult legal entry to the country can be. And it makes a lot more sense why individuals would choose to come here illegally. So we're going to take a look at some barriers to services. So in the comments box below, you'll find the link to a video. Go ahead and pause this presentation and watch that video, and then you can come back and we'll continue. So welcome back. Up on the screen, you'll see some information we've touched on a few times so far in the presentation. So some things that create barriers for the Hispanic population specifically. Immigration status, we've touched on. 64% of Hispanic victims fear deportation. Not knowing their rights and then having lack of documentation in order to receive benefits can definitely create barriers for them leaving an abusive partner. There's a lack of knowledge overall about intimate partner violence and the services and options that are available, and then just the complexity of the legal system. Even native born people who speak English, who have lived here their whole lives, have a difficult time navigating the legal system when it becomes necessary. So for an individual that isn't from here, that doesn't speak this language, it can be extremely complicated to figure out what they need to do and how to engage with the criminal justice system. Studies have also found that language and cultural differences act as significant barriers. So you've got your language barrier. Even if an individual learns English, it's not their native language. Their understanding may not ever be the same as somebody who's fluent, who is a native speaker of it. Trying to find translators can be extremely difficult. Oftentimes, especially in rural communities, when a Hispanic individual is going forward to make a report to law enforcement or the hospital or whatever it may be, there's not a translator that those agencies have for that and that victim, that survivor, to work with. They are oftentimes having to do it through a third party over the phone translator. Sort of like a 1-800 number that agency can call, that the victim and the provider can speak to an interpreter. That's not a great way to go about it. It's very sterile. It just doesn't build a trusting relationship. And then for those even more isolated pockets of individuals, I mentioned the Cora community here in Gunnison at the beginning of the presentation. That population oftentimes is not even fluent in Spanish. They might speak a little bit of it. Sometimes it's a really basic form of Spanish, so a Spanish translator is not going to help them. Finding someone who speaks Cora is almost impossible. So those individuals are even more isolated from seeking services and seeking help. A study has found that 1 in 3 shelters did not have any Spanish-speaking staff. Up until a couple of years ago, Project Hope didn't either. We used interpreters, but if we had to deal with somebody on the spot, it wasn't great services that were being provided to those individuals. Also, just the diversity of cultural values are sometimes not respected. And if you're not respecting that value system, if that client, if that individual doesn't feel safe in that environment as a result of their belief system, they're not going to come back for services. And you can guarantee that they're going to tell their friends, their acquaintances about their experience. And so the likelihood of other people coming forward to seek services is diminished greatly. So some testimonies. If you look up on the screen, you'll see some quotes from survivors. These are really just meant to highlight the unique barriers that immigrant victims face. So go ahead and take a moment to read the information. So that smaller text box, that language barrier, in this case, officers using a perpetrator to translate for a victim. There's so many things that are wrong with that, but it's a very real situation. Victims are so often getting arrested alongside of their perpetrators, and they're being punished alongside their perpetrators. And that's not going to foster a environment of trust for the immigrant population. So in the comments box below is a link to another video. This is Grace's story. Go ahead and pause this presentation and watch that video before you come back. Okay, welcome back. So that video was a testimony from a domestic violence victim from El Salvador. So there are some questions on the quiz that relate to this video. You are welcome to fill that out now, or you can go back to it at the end. But it is important for you to know where immigrant victims come from in order to better serve them. So next we are going to transition into immigration relief and benefits. So there are some good news for domestic violence and sexual assault survivors that do not have legal status or would like to gain citizenship benefits. So there are two that we are going to focus on. The first one is VAWA, and the second one is a U visa. So we're going to start with VAWA. VAWA stands for the Violence Against Women Act, although I would like to point out that men are also protected under this. So under VAWA, a domestic violence survivor can file a self-petition that would allow them to apply for immigration benefit without having to depend on their spouse or any other family member. So a few slides ago, we showed you the process to come here legally. So you have to be sponsored. That could be a family member, somebody who's already here that is a citizenship or has some sort of legal standing, or that could be a spouse or a partner. And that spouse or partner could be a U.S. citizen who's sponsoring their immigrant partner, or it could be somebody who gained legal citizenship or legal standing in the States. So you have to be sponsored. That person helps fill out the paperwork and they're sort of vouching for you. Well, the problem is that we started to realize that immigrants were very vulnerable as a result of this system. If their partner was the person who was sponsoring them to be here, then their partner could hold that sponsorship over their head as a way to control them. It also prevented the victim from leaving the situation. So VAWA was established, so rather than having to be sponsored by someone, a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, there's a few other things, but they would be able to self-petition the government. So rather than relying on somebody to sponsor them and to help them gain legal status, they could do it themselves. So there is a video that gives a brief overview of VAWA. That's in the comments box below, so go ahead and click that link and watch the video. Okay, so some things to keep in mind for filing with VAWA. So currently, VAWA self-petitions are taking more than 1 year to be processed. However, that processing time can change at any moment. So it could become less, it could become more. You only have about 2 years after getting a divorce to file a VAWA self-petition, and you are not able to remarry while the process is pending. You do not have to get a divorce or be separated from your spouse to qualify for this benefit. The entire process to get the green card is actually about 2.5 to 3 years in terms of the amount of time that it takes. That, of course, can change depending on volume, request, etc. So the second option for victims is something called a U visa. So the U visa is a non-immigrant visa that is set aside for victims of qualifying crimes that have happened in the U.S. This allows victims to live in the U.S. for 4 years. It gives them permission to work, and it can even allow some family members to receive the visa as well. There is a short video explaining U visa, so go ahead and click that in the comments box below. So some things to keep in mind when filing for the U visa. The process of filing can take up to months and even years. If you apply for a U visa and you have a letter of deportation, the U visa does not save you from getting deported. So in some cases, we've even had at least one client who had received a letter of deportation before she was able to start this process. Once you receive that letter, there's not anything that can really stop you from getting deported. While the U visa lasts for 4 years, clients can apply for permanent residency after 3 years of living in the U.S. with the U visa. There are more than 160,000 individuals who apply each year. U visa cases that are approved can be waitlisted, which protects clients against removal and provides a basis for work authorization while the waitlist for an available visa is ongoing. It can take 8 to 10 years to obtain the visa, so this is a very long process. There is not a time period in which you must apply for the U visa. However, it all depends on the law enforcement agency's policy. Law enforcement does not have to sign the U visa certification if they don't want to. So the U visa is something that is only provided to victims who choose to report. So someone who does not want to report to law enforcement does not have the option of a U visa. They could still do the VAWA stuff, but U visa is not an option for them. So looking at the differences then between VAWA or U visa. So with VAWA, you have to be married to a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident, rather than with a U visa, you don't actually have to be married to somebody in one of those categories. The U visa applies to victims of any qualifying crime that happened in the U.S., things like sexual assault, domestic violence, felonies, just to name a few. The U visa requires the client to cooperate with law enforcement in the case. A VAWA self-petitioner is not required to have had any contact with law enforcement. U visa applicants have an easier time getting their crimes, if they committed any, forgiven by the government. So, for example, entering without permission. But on the other hand, VAWA self-petitioners' past can affect the approval process. So if they were charged with any sort of crime, that could potentially keep them from getting a VAWA. There is no limit for relief under VAWA, whereas there is a cap on U visas. They only give out $10,000 a year. The relief lasts indefinitely for approved VAWA petitions, whereas U visas only last for 4 years. So how to serve immigrant victims. Providing services in their language or at minimum, an interpretation service is going to be the most important thing to do. So I realize that for our volunteers, you may not be bilingual. You won't really have a lot of interaction with these clients. But we do have a bilingual staff person. Hopefully we'll end up with more down the road. And we always are looking for volunteer advocates that are bilingual as well to help make sure that clients can be in contact with us easily. Being culturally aware, though, and respecting those cultural differences is something that everybody can do, regardless of whether or not you speak the language. Starting where the client is, and then making sure to educate them about their rights as an immigrant are all good practices. Keep in mind that our Latino clients that we serve at Project Hope, many of them have at least some understanding of English. Some of them even speak more than you realize they do. So, don't treat them like they're stupid or that they don't understand. When you are interacting with them, that behavior is going to be communicated, whether or not the two individuals speak the same language. Okay? Remember that for this population, spirituality and religion is very important in their healing process. So incorporating spirituality into conversations or finding resources that will help meet that need. Remember that the clients, immigrant clients, are often fearful of deportation. Make sure to acknowledge that fear is valid. Don't ever promise that they're not going to get deported. It is important to review their rights as an immigrant and not to ignore the risk of deportation. And then remember that it takes time to build trust, so be patient. These individuals don't just automatically trust the individuals that they're working with. That takes time. So this is our last slide for the presentation. So I realized that was just scraping the surface for the immigrant population, but we just really wanted to give you kind of a brief overview of some of the unique differences that these survivors face compared to Native survivors, because there are definitely differences. Although you may not get a chance to work directly with these individuals if you don't speak Spanish, you will most likely end up helping with some behind the scenes stuff. There's so much extra work that has to go into these cases compared to our English speaking survivors. Even just simple daily tasks sometimes requires intervention from one of our advocates. Calling a doctor's office to help them make an appointment. Calling a utility company to figure out what needs to be done, or translating a letter for them that they received that they don't understand. There's just so much more that goes into working with this population than for most of our English-speaking survivors. So thank you for listening. Make sure that you complete the quiz for this section.